It began in silence, in the ashes of Europe, among the ruins of cities that had burned, in the shadows of graves that stretched beyond counting. The war was over, but the wounds were not. The victors had marched home. The guns had gone quiet. Yet across the world, a different kind of battle was just beginning. This was not a war for land or power, but for memory, for justice, and for the souls of the dead. It was the hunt for those who had vanished. The architects of genocide, the officers of the SS, the doctors of death, the bureaucrats of annihilation. They had fled across oceans and continents, changed their names, burned their papers, and disappeared into the crowd. But others, driven by conscience, by vengeance, or by duty, swore that the guilty would never rest. These were the Nazi hunters, soldiers, spies, survivors, and prosecutors who refused to let history bury its crimes. Their mission would span decades. Their pursuit would define justice in the modern age. In 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, chaos reigned. Germany lay in ruins, its cities flattened, its armies shattered, its leaders dead or in hiding. Millions of displaced people wandered through the rubble, prisoners, refugees, and the remnants of an empire that had consumed half the world. Amid that chaos, thousands of Nazi officials vanished. Some were captured by Allied troops, but many slipped away. They forged new identities, found safe passage through underground escape networks, known as Ratlines, and fled to sympathetic nations: Spain, Italy, Argentina, Chile, Syria, and Egypt. With money stolen from the Reich treasury, and aided by the silence of those who feared what exposure might reveal, they built new lives under false names. The world, weary from war, wanted to move on, but for some forgetting was impossible. In the immediate aftermath, justice came first through the courts. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, a reckoning unprecedented in human history. 22 of the highest-ranking Nazi leaders stood before the world, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: film reels from concentration camps, documents signed in cold ink, testimonies that defied belief. Yet Nuremberg was only the beginning. For every leader condemned in court, 100 others had escaped. Scientists who once designed weapons for Hitler now worked for foreign governments. Doctors who had conducted lethal experiments vanished into hospitals and laboratories abroad. SS officers hid among refugees, their tattoos burned away, their uniforms buried in forests and fields. Justice, it seemed, was being buried with them. But the hunters were already on their trail. Men like Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of the concentration camps, dedicated their lives to tracking the fugitives. From a small office in Vienna, Wiesenthal built an international network of informants, piecing together clues, following whispers, and identifying the men who thought they were safe. He helped uncover the location of Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, a man who had organized the deportation of millions of Jews to their deaths. Eichmann had fled to Argentina under the alias Ricardo Clement, living a quiet life in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. But in 1960, after years of investigation, agents of Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, found him. One night, they seized him from the street, smuggled him aboard a plane, and brought him to Jerusalem. His trial in 1961 was a watershed moment, a confrontation not only between a man and his victims, but between the world and its conscience. Eichmann sat in a glass booth, impassive, as survivor after survivor spoke the truth he had tried to erase. His conviction and execution proved that time and distance would not shield the guilty forever. Others followed. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, lived for decades under a false identity in Bolivia, before being captured in 1983 and returned to France to face trial. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, evaded justice until his death in Brazil in 1979, his name becoming a ghost story whispered across continents. Erich Priebke, Franz Stangl, and countless others were hunted, exposed, and brought before the world to account for their crimes. Some trials took place in courtrooms, others played out in the public eye as hidden truths finally surfaced. Behind each name was a network, men and women who refused to give up, who sifted through archives, interviewed witnesses, and followed rumors that spanned oceans and generations. Their fight was not one of vengeance, but of remembrance, to prove that justice, though delayed, was not dead. The Nazi hunters came from many nations, united by a single belief that evil must never be allowed to vanish into history unpunished. Some were survivors seeking peace, others were soldiers who could not forget what they had seen in the camps. Governments joined the hunt, the Americans with Operation Paperclip and the Office of Special Investigations, the Israelis with Mossad, the Germans with late efforts to purge their past. Their methods varied: espionage, legal battles, political pressure, but their purpose was the same. They were chasing more than men. They were chasing ghosts. Each capture, each confession was a message to the future, that memory must outlast denial, and that even after war ends, the moral reckoning continues. As the decades passed, the hunt grew quieter, but never truly ended. Files once hidden in archives were opened. Trials continued into the 21st century, as frail, aged men were led into courtrooms to face the weight of crimes committed in their youth. To some it seemed futile, too late, too symbolic. But to the survivors who still lived, and to the generations who inherited their pain, it mattered deeply. Justice was not about revenge. It was about dignity. It was about saying that the world remembers even when time tries to forget. The story of the Nazi hunters is a story of pursuit, but also of warning that justice is not an act but a responsibility. It reminds us that the crimes of history do not fade with those who commit them, and that truth, though buried, can still rise through the cracks of silence. In their relentless search for accountability, the hunters gave voice to the voiceless and ensured that even the most powerful criminals would live in the shadow of their own guilt. Tonight we follow in their footsteps, through the ruins of Europe, the alleys of Buenos Aires, the jungles of South America, and the archives of memory, to trace the men and women who refused to forget. This is the entire history of the Nazi hunters, the pursuit of justice after the war. The story of how the ghosts of the past were chased across continents, and how the fight for truth became the conscience of a world reborn from ashes. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The war had ended, but the air still carried the weight of smoke and sorrow. Across the broken cities of Europe, silence settled where once the roar of artillery had lived. The streets were littered with memories more than rubble: the scent of ash, the whisper of wind through hollow windows, the faint echo of footsteps that would not return. People emerged from cellars and ruins like ghosts, blinking into daylight. They were alive, yet unsure what life meant now. The walls bore shadows of what had been, as if the light itself hesitated to enter. Trains began to run again, though no one was sure where they led. Flags were raised, but they fluttered weakly, uncertain of whom they represented. Victory had come, yet it felt like defeat's quieter twin, and in that uneasy peace, the question began to form: where had the guilty gone? In the small hours of dawn, men and women began to count the missing. The numbers were beyond comprehension. 6 million here, 2 million there. A continent turned into a ledger of loss. In towns and villages, names were read aloud, only to fade into the stillness that followed. Some people refused to believe the scale, while others could no longer bear to remember. The churches reopened their doors, but even prayer felt thin, like a thread frayed by too much grief. Across the countryside, soldiers went home in silence, unsure what peace was meant to feel like. Governments formed, borders shifted, new maps were drawn over the old. Yet behind each new beginning was a shadow, long and quiet. The war was over, but not finished. And beneath the ruins, the truth still breathed softly, waiting to be found. Many of those who had served the old regime simply vanished. Some changed their names, others crossed borders hidden among refugees. In the confusion of surrender, uniforms were burned, insignias buried, papers rewritten. The machinery of destruction had dissolved into a sea of faces, ordinary, forgettable, human. The victors were exhausted, their attention scattered by hunger, rebuilding, and the looming new rivalries of a divided world. It was easy to overlook a few missing officers, a few men in plain coats boarding a train south. Justice, for the moment, slept under the weight of fatigue. Yet for those who had survived the camps, the silence was unbearable. They carried not anger, but a steady, smouldering need to know. In that quiet need, the first seeds of the hunt began to take root. Ruins do not speak, but they remember in the shattered synagogues, in the empty barracks, in the grass growing over forgotten fields. Memory gathered like mist. Some people walked the ruins with notebooks, recording what they saw, though they could not yet name what it meant. Others collected photographs, letters, small pieces of paper that had survived where people had not. The idea of evidence was new and fragile, like the first bud after a hard winter. Few imagined that such fragments could ever bring justice, yet they held on to them anyway. For the survivors, it was a way of refusing erasure. The Allies collected documents by the ton, though not always knowing why. Somewhere in the quiet rooms of post-war Europe, the story of the hunters was beginning to whisper. The war had ended in fire, but what followed was built from patience and silence. In Vienna, a man who had survived the camps began to list names on scraps of paper. In Poland, another kept a diary of officials he remembered by voice, not face. Across Germany, displaced persons searched the newspapers for familiar surnames. It was not vengeance that moved them, but something gentler, a desire to restore the symmetry of truth. Some of them wrote to authorities who never replied. Others simply waited, trusting that memory would one day find its answer. Meanwhile, in old farmhouses and rented rooms, those who had served the Reich began to hide their traces. They grew beards, worked as laborers, taught children to read, and prayed the past would stay buried. But time has a way of carrying secrets upward, like dust in morning light, and soon the world would begin to see what it had tried to forget. Europe in 1945 was a continent of travelers without destinations. Refugees, soldiers, widows, orphans, all moving through the same stations, sharing the same bread, unaware that among them walked the men who had orchestrated catastrophe. There were no fences strong enough to divide the innocent from the guilty, no sign above a door to reveal who had once given orders in the night. In this quiet confusion, justice was both everywhere and nowhere. People learned to live beside ghosts, to greet strangers with a cautious nod. The newspapers spoke of rebuilding, yet no one spoke of reckoning. The soldiers of the Allies went home, the soldiers of the Reich went missing. In every crowd, history wore a borrowed face, and the wind that moved through the stations carried more than the dust of departure. Months turned to years. The ruins were cleared, streets repaved, factories reopened, Children were born who would never remember the noise of war. The smell of smoke began to fade, replaced by the scent of bread and rain. Yet for those who had lost everything, peace was not a comfort. It was a reminder of what had not yet been answered. They saw the former officials walking freely in new clothes, the doctors and officers living quietly in distant towns. Some had escaped to South America, others lived in plain sight, and as the world began to rebuild, a few voices refused to be drowned out by progress. They spoke softly at first, but their words carried far. In the calm after the storm, the call for justice began to rise like a faint bell. By the late 1940s, the world was changing again. The Cold War had begun, shifting attention from the crimes of the past to the fears of the future. Files were locked away, secrets traded for alliances, truth bent beneath politics. But somewhere beneath those tides, quiet people still searched, archivists, soldiers, survivors, and lawyers, with tired eyes. They followed trails not of footprints, but of names, letters, and whispers. They believed that memory itself could be a form of pursuit. Europe was healing, but the past had not finished speaking. Justice moved slowly, but it had already begun its long walk through time. And as the century turned toward new fears, the shadow of the old ones lingered, waiting for those who would follow it into the light. The war's end did not bring order, only a different kind of confusion. Borders were redrawn with trembling hands, and cities that had been bombed into silence now hummed with restless movement. Millions drifted across the continent, searching for homes that no longer existed, or families that would never return. In this wandering tide, truth and deceit walked side by side, indistinguishable beneath hunger and dust. Soldiers without countries became laborers, prisoners became civilians, and those who had served the old flags learned to blend into the crowd. Forged documents passed from one desperate hand to another, as easy to find as bread on the black market. The occupying forces did their best to bring structure, but even they were lost in the fog of endless needs. Lines at border posts stretched for miles, filled with faces that told stories no one had time to hear. The world was tired of war, and tired eyes often fail to see clearly. And so, under the soft disguise of peace, the first shadows began to move unnoticed. In ruined villages and crowded train stations, the defeated learned to adapt. They spoke new languages with borrowed accents, shaved their mustaches, took on humble trades. A man who had once given orders to thousands now swept floors in a monastery. Another, who had sent trains eastward, now worked quietly as a clerk for the Red Cross. The weight of guilt was hidden behind polite smiles and forged birth certificates. The Allies, overwhelmed by the human tide, focused on feeding and housing millions. To them, every refugee looked the same: weary, lost, broken. Few had the energy to search for faces from faded photographs. The war had left no strength for suspicion. And so the search for survival became the perfect disguise for those who wished to remain unseen. The first months after surrender were marked by small, unseen choices. A soldier burned a uniform in a field at dusk. A file clerk hesitated before typing a name correctly. A village priest signed a false baptismal record to protect someone who said he was repentant. Each act seemed small, even merciful, but together they created a fog thicker than smoke. In that fog, the line between compassion and concealment blurred. Some felt pity for the defeated, others fear of chaos returning, and some simply wished to forget. The Allies spoke of justice, but their attention drifted toward rebuilding and the coming division between East and West. Every act of forgetting gave the hidden a little more time to vanish. Memory too began to fade beneath the noise of reconstruction. And in that fading, the world lost sight of the faces it had promised never to forget. There were rumors then, whispers in refugee camps about men who had once worn black uniforms, now dressed in rags. No one knew what to believe. Hunger had replaced truth as the greater urgency. The displaced person camps overflowed, and lists of names stretched longer each week. The Red Cross, overwhelmed and underinformed, became both savior and shield. Many of its documents were written in haste, with little time for careful verification. The forgeries grew more convincing, sometimes created by former officials who still had access to old stamps and typewriters. Some escaped through charity, others through deception, all beneath the same exhausted sky. By the time officials realized how many had slipped away, the trails were already cold. And so, even as new borders were drawn, the map of guilt began to dissolve. In Austria and southern Germany, small monasteries became sanctuaries not just for the faithful, but for those fleeing their past. Monks gave bread and silence in equal measure, and not all asked who they were sheltering. In the stillness of their stone walls, men who had once shouted orders now prayed for forgiveness, or simply for time. Some truly repented, others only waited for opportunity. There was a kind of quiet understanding among those who hid, a belief that the world would soon forget, as all worlds do. The Allied patrols passed by, their eyes fixed on roads, not souls. Winter came, softening the edges of ruins with snow. The world looked cleaner, though nothing had truly been washed away. Beneath the white stillness, movement continued, careful, cautious, deliberate. And history, for a moment, seemed to rest beneath a blanket of calm deception. The Allies faced a dilemma that few spoke of openly. Their armies had won the war, but peace required new enemies, new allies, and uncomfortable compromises. The Soviet Union loomed to the east, its influence spreading like cold wind. Western intelligence agencies, newly formed, began to see value in men who understood that wind, men who had once served the Reich's machinery of information. Some were quietly recruited, their crimes sealed away beneath official seals. Science, espionage, and technology became currencies more powerful than conscience. The world was changing too quickly for justice to keep pace. Even among the victors, morality blurred in the name of security. What had begun as chaos was slowly hardening into policy, and within that policy, many of the guilty found their safest refuge. Ordinary people continued their lives, unaware that they walked beside the architects of horror. A baker in Munich, a teacher in Linz, a gardener in Rome, all names borrowed, all lives reinvented. The survivors who recognized them often chose silence, out of fear or disbelief. Who would believe that the man serving soup at a charity kitchen had once commanded death in a faraway camp? Silence, at first a mercy, became complicity. Newspapers turned their attention to rebuilding, to optimism, to the promise of a united Europe. The world wanted light, not shadow. And yet, under that hopeful surface, the roots of truth grew stronger, unseen but alive. Because even in silence, the earth remembers the weight of footsteps. By 1947, whispers of organized escape routes began to spread. There were trails through Italy, ships from Genoa and Trieste, networks run by those who claimed to offer salvation to all, regardless of sin. Many of the guilty followed these paths, disappearing into South America, the Middle East, even the United States. Each crossing erased a name, rewrote a story, and deepened the stillness of the post-war years. Yet not all eyes were closed. Among the survivors and scattered investigators, suspicion began to take shape. Slow, patient, unrelenting. They collected rumors as others collected relics, knowing that in every rumor there was a trace of truth. Europe was quiet, but beneath that quietness, the pulse of the hunt had already begun to beat. And in the fog of peace, the guilty learned to disappear, while the search for them, silent and unseen, began to awaken. The war had scattered lives like leaves in a winter wind, but among the ruins a few quiet minds began to gather them back together. In old offices with broken windows, desks were set up once more, and paper became the new battlefield. The men and women who worked there were not heroes of arms but of patience. They opened dusty files, searching for patterns among the names that had been left behind. Each list they wrote was part memory, part guesswork, part prayer. Some of the names came from survivors, others from soldiers who had seen too much, still others from the archives of the fallen Reich. The task was endless, yet no one spoke of stopping. There was a rhythm to their work, pen to paper, page to page, name to silence. The sound of writing became its own kind of mourning, and with every line written, the distance between the living and the lost grew a little clearer. At first the lists were crude, often incomplete, sometimes wrong. The chaos of liberation had left more confusion than clarity. Files were burned, names misspelled, whole identities swallowed by translation and haste. Still the work continued, for even error was better than forgetting. Soldiers who once carried rifles now carried notebooks, walking through camps with solemn eyes. They spoke with survivors, recorded testimonies, and wrote as though each word might anchor a drifting soul. In the margins of their papers were smudges of ash and fingerprints, faint, human, fragile. There was no order yet, no system, just the slow gathering of fragments. From this humble beginning, the first maps of justice began to form, and in the quiet scratching of pens, history took its first step toward remembrance. The British called them wanted lists. The Americans index cards of suspects. The Soviets kept their own ledgers, written in Cyrillic and secrecy. But for those who wrote them, they were simply lists of ghosts, people known by rumor, by fragments of testimony, by the faint outline of guilt. Every nation built its own registry, though few knew how to share what they found. Communication was slow, and politics often interfered. Some names were erased before they were ever read. Others were repeated on every list, like echoes that refused to fade. There was no great revelation, only the slow accumulation of truth. And in that accumulation, the first fragile shape of accountability began to appear. Many of those compiling the names were young, barely more than boys when the war ended. They wore ill-fitting uniforms and carried fatigue in their faces, yet they worked with the care of monks. Some spoke several languages, others knew none well enough to understand the testimonies before them. Still they listened. They learned to hear the rhythm of memory, to sense when a survivor's voice trembled, not from fear but recognition. They cross-referenced, compared, corrected, and continued. In their quiet diligence, a new kind of soldier was born, one who fought not with bullets, but with memory. They understood that behind each name was a story unfinished, and through their quiet devotion, the impossible began to feel inevitable. In Nuremberg, new offices filled with typewriters, cables, and the endless shuffle of paper. Lawyers, translators, and clerks worked together to create the foundation for trials yet to come. Their walls were lined with folders marked evidence, though what they truly contained was sorrow transformed into structure. For the first time in history, nations sought to hold individuals, not just governments, accountable for war. The task was vast and uncertain, but within the clatter of keys and the rustle of forms, there was something deeply human, a longing to bring order to the unimaginable. The lists grew longer each week, their ink fading slightly under the weight of constant handling. Some pages tore, some were lost, but the memory behind them endured. And beneath that endurance, justice was learning how to breathe. Elsewhere, far from the legal halls, ordinary people made their own lists. A widow in Warsaw, a teacher in Prague, a rabbi in Amsterdam, all writing down names they feared the world would forget. These were not official records, but acts of love disguised as documentation. In the margins, small notes were scribbled: lived on our street, never returned, kind eyes. These lists were passed hand to hand, sometimes hidden in bread, sometimes tucked into prayer books. They held no power in court, yet they carried the weight of truth. To those who made them, writing was an act of faith, a belief that the lost could still be seen. Their quiet persistence mirrored that of the investigators far away, and somewhere between the official files and the handwritten prayers, a shared memory began to bloom. Not everyone welcomed these efforts. Some thought it better to move on, to let the past rest beneath reconstruction. Politicians spoke of unity, not reckoning. Even among the Allies, fatigue blurred the moral line between justice and closure. The world was rebuilding, and those lists were reminders of wounds that many wished to forget. But truth has its own gravity, and it pulls quietly at the conscience of the living. The names refused to fade, returning again in testimonies, letters, and uneasy dreams. For some investigators, the work became a kind of calling, something that outlived their official orders. What began as duty grew into devotion. And in that devotion, the idea of Nazi hunting took its first silent breath. By the late 1940s, the first comprehensive war crimes lists had been compiled. Thousands of names, soldiers, officers, doctors, bureaucrats, neatly arranged in alphabetical order. Yet behind that neatness lay uncertainty, loss, and longing. Some of the guilty were already dead, others hidden beneath false identities, others still protected by politics. The investigators knew their lists were incomplete, but they also knew they mattered. For every name written down, a fragment of justice was reclaimed. They could not yet imagine how long the search would last, or how far it would travel. All they knew was that silence had finally begun to speak in ink. And every name was a whisper from the ashes, and someone had to listen. After the war, the camps did not vanish. They only changed their purpose. Where once there had been barbed wire and commands, there were now tents and relief signs written in many languages. People arrived by the thousands, carrying all they owned in a single bag or a folded photograph. The air was heavy with the scent of soap, damp canvas, and boiled potatoes. Aid workers moved quietly among them, distributing food, blankets, and forms to fill. Yet in the quiet hours between meals, memories began to stir like restless wind through the sleeping rows. The people here were not merely refugees, they were witnesses who had seen the shape of cruelty and lived to describe it. Each had a name to offer, a face remembered, a small fragment of truth buried beneath exhaustion. Their words came slowly at first, hesitant and fractured. And in those murmured recollections, the world began to hear what history had tried to silence. In those early days, no one called it testimony. They were simply stories told over soup, or whispered before sleep. A man might mention a guard's name as if exhaling a burden. A woman might recall the color of a uniform, or the sound of a voice calling the roll. Relief workers wrote down what they could, often without knowing the weight of what they recorded. The papers were passed along, translated, copied, and filed. Many were lost to weather or time, yet enough survived to form the roots of remembrance. Out of these unstructured stories, investigators began to sense patterns. The same names appearing again and again, the same towns, the same dates. Memory was becoming evidence, and from the tired lips of survivors, the hunt began to take its quiet shape. The camps themselves were strange crossroads of humanity. There were soldiers who had deserted, widows with no family left, children who did not know their real names. Language barriers made everything slower, softer. Yiddish mixed with Polish, Russian with English, German with silence. Translators became bridges between worlds, carrying sorrow from one tongue to another. Some of them broke down in the process, unable to carry so much grief in borrowed words, but most continued, steady and patient, understanding that each translation was an act of preservation. The displaced were not only lost geographically, they were lost in time. And each story told pulled the world a little closer to knowing what had truly happened. The Allies set up special offices inside the camps to record information. These were small, often makeshift rooms filled with paper, typewriters, and weary clerks. Survivors came to speak, not knowing if anyone was truly listening. Many could not hold eye contact when recalling the past. Others spoke with a strange calmness, as if retelling someone else's dream. The investigators wrote carefully, afraid of misunderstanding even a single name. A misplaced letter might mean a vanished truth. Over time, they noticed something remarkable, that the stories, though fragmented, began to converge. The same officers appeared in different memories, the same commands, the same towns. And slowly, the scattered memories began to align into the faint outline of a map. Children, too, were witnesses, though they rarely understood what they carried. Some drew pictures of trains and fences, without knowing their meaning. Psychologists who visited the camps began to realize that trauma was not only a wound, but a kind of archive. In the absence of documents, these living memories became the only records left. The faces of the children, the inflections of the elderly, the silences between words, all were part of the evidence that justice would one day need. The people who gathered these testimonies treated them with quiet reverence. They knew that in every whispered recollection was the weight of a life unseen. To write it down was to honor the lost. To listen was to resist forgetting. And through listening, the world began to awaken to the depth of its own amnesia. Life in the camps moved in rhythms both ordinary and strange. There were lines for bread, songs sung softly at dusk, weddings held among ruins. Hope and grief coexisted under the same thin roof. The survivors tried to rebuild themselves, even as they spoke of what had destroyed them. The interviews often took place in these quiet interludes between the daily acts of endurance. An investigator might ask about a name, and a survivor would pause, gaze toward the horizon, and then remember. Each recollection was like a lantern lit against a long night. Bit by bit, the fog that had hidden the guilty began to thin. And though the world outside had moved on, within these camps the past still breathed. For some, the telling became a kind of release. They had held their memories too tightly for too long, unsure if anyone would ever believe them. Now at last, they found listeners who did not turn away. The investigators were patient, even gentle. They learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and that truth arrived not as confession, but as recognition. The camps became quiet classrooms of remembrance, where the survivors taught the world how to listen. Each conversation built upon the last, each note a fragment of the greater whole. What began as chaos was slowly becoming coherence. And in that fragile coherence, The first witnesses found their purpose again. By the late 1940s, thousands of testimonies had been gathered from the displaced camps. They filled boxes and folders, marked with the names of places that had ceased to exist. To many officials, they were just papers to the survivors. They were a resurrection of the unseen. The words written there would one day guide investigators to doors long closed, to faces long hidden. But for now they remained within the quiet hum of the camps, breathing, waiting, enduring. The people who told their stories were tired, yet lighter. Their words had entered the world again, carried by others who understood their meaning. The tent still flapped in the wind, the ration line still stretched at dawn, but something new had begun beneath the surface. For among the tents and ration lines, the first witnesses began to remember, and the hunt for truth began to awaken from its sleep. After the war, Europe was still a map of broken lines, both in geography and in conscience. Soldiers returned home, governments sought stability, and yet a quieter, deeper call began to echo through the ruins. It was not the call of armies, nor of politics, but of memory itself, a reminder that those who had orchestrated cruelty could not simply vanish. Small units were formed, often from those who had seen both sides of the war. These were not soldiers of tanks and rifles, but of patience and observation. They pored over lists, testimonies, and documents, following threads that seemed almost invisible. Their work was slow, deliberate, and methodical, guided by intuition and empathy. Every file, every note, every whispered recollection became a tool in this new pursuit. The hunt had no trophies, no parades, only the quiet gathering of truth. And in this quiet, the first real steps toward justice began to take form. The moral landscape was shifting. Military victory had ended the fighting, but it had not healed the soul of Europe. Courts could prosecute a few, but the vast web of guilt stretched beyond any courtroom. The survivors, the witnesses, the investigators understood that justice would require more than verdicts. It would require diligence, memory, and unrelenting attention. Small units were trained to track individuals, piecing together identities from fragments of evidence. Some came from intelligence, others from law enforcement, and still others from the ranks of the liberated, whose knowledge of the enemy had never faded. They learned to read the subtleties of human behavior, the pauses in speech, the flicker of recognition in a glance. It was a pursuit of understanding, of verification, and of respect for those who had suffered. And so the notion of Nazi hunters was born, quiet, patient, and resolute. These early hunters moved through a world still in recovery. Cities were being rebuilt, train lines restored, and families reunited. Amid the everyday noise of renewal, the hunters followed invisible threads. Sometimes it was a name on a ration card, a signature on a Red Cross list, or a stray word from a survivor. They traveled quietly from town to town, often blending into the crowds, listening without intruding. Their methods were not violent but precise. Interviews, comparisons, observations. In their notebooks, they documented the small consistencies that revealed hidden truths. Slowly, the scattered fragments of post-war Europe began to form a lattice of memory. And in that lattice, the first outlines of accountability emerged, delicate and strong at once. For many, this work was deeply personal. Some hunters had lost family members, some had witnessed horrors firsthand, and others simply carried the weight of conscience. They did not seek revenge, but understanding. They did not crave recognition, but accuracy. Theirs was a silent devotion, often unacknowledged by governments that were eager to rebuild and move on. Yet the hunters persisted, guided by an inner compass that refused to let the guilty walk unnoticed. They shared information across borders, collaborating slowly, cautiously, across languages and politics. Every success was measured not in arrests, but in clarity, in the gentle illumination of truth. And with each discovery, the world learned a little more about the men who had vanished into shadow. And the quiet, moral purpose of the hunt began to grow like dawn across the continent. The creation of specialized war crimes units formalized what had been instinctive work. Offices were established, files meticulously organized, and protocols written with care. Yet despite structure, the work remained painstakingly slow. Each investigation required verification from multiple sources, often across difficult terrain and shifting borders. Survivors were interviewed again and again, and documents were scrutinized under soft lamplight in empty rooms. Sometimes weeks passed without a single clue. Other times a small fragment would illuminate a vast network. The hunters learned patience, discovering that justice is a long, steady current rather than a sudden wave. And so, a new profession emerged, defined by diligence, empathy, and the power of careful observation. Communication between nations became a quiet lifeline. Letters, reports, and cables traveled through post offices and embassies, carrying information that could determine life or obscurity. Mistakes were costly, yet honesty prevailed among those who understood the stakes. Occasionally, names that appeared in one city would be confirmed by testimony hundreds of miles away. The hunters began to see patterns. The routes, the disguises, the networks that had allowed so many to vanish. They did not act on impulse, but mapped the terrain of human behavior, following the currents of fear, greed, and hope. In doing so, they discovered that evil, while adaptable, left traces in its passage. And with each trace followed, the promise of accountability grew stronger, steady as a river beneath ice. Many hunters worked in solitude, moving like quiet wind through towns and records. They often slept little, their dreams filled with names and places. Yet there was a calm rhythm to their diligence, a meditation in repetition. Their tools were notebooks, photographs, letters, and patience. They learned to observe not only the visible world, but also the spaces between words and gestures. Even the faintest recollection from a survivor could open a door that had been closed for years. Each day added a small piece to the puzzle, slowly revealing the hidden map of those who had sought to escape. They measured progress, not in applause but in the soft satisfaction of truth uncovered. And as the hunters' understanding deepened, so did the moral clarity of their pursuit. By the early 1950s, the first successes began to appear. Small arrests, quiet confrontations, and the careful documentation of identities became tangible proof that the world would not forget. These were not grand gestures. They were gentle assertions of memory over oblivion. The hunters had become the guardians of conscience, armed not with guns, but with persistence and understanding. Their work would continue for decades, spanning continents, languages, and generations. And though each step forward was slow, it carried with it the weight of thousands of whispered names, memories waiting to be honored. Justice would need its own soldiers, armed with memory instead of guns. And the first of these silent soldiers had begun to walk among the ruins. In the early years after the war, the world's attention began to shift toward new horizons. The Allies were no longer only occupiers but emerging competitors, each wary of the other across a growing divide. Amid the ruins, men who had once built weapons of destruction were now seen as keys to the future. Their knowledge of rockets, aviation, and chemistry made them valuable, almost indispensable, to the nations that had once opposed them. Agreements were made quietly, papers shuffled, and names removed from lists that had once marked them for justice. It was a compromise between expedience and morality, a soft settling of scales that had been tipped by circumstance. Many of those involved carried unease in their hearts, knowing that the people they employed had overseen horrors that could not easily be forgotten. And yet the promise of progress often outweighed the weight of memory. And so, beneath a calm surface, the seeds of moral tension began to take root. In the United States, Operation Paperclip quietly gathered the expertise of former scientists and engineers. They arrived by boat and plane, passports sanitized, histories carefully rewritten. Some carried the knowledge of laboratories, others of factories, and some of military operations. To the world outside, they were simply new engineers and researchers, stepping quietly into laboratories and offices. Yet in the hearts of those who remembered, they carried ghosts. Survivors, investigators, and lists of the guilty were still alive, waiting to recognize them. The bargain was clear: their expertise would be used for progress, and their past would be softened or hidden. In the dim light of laboratories and offices, science moved forward while judgment lingered in shadow. And across the Atlantic, similar choices were quietly being made by other nations. The Soviet Union, too, recruited those whose knowledge could not be ignored. Cities like Moscow and Kiev became destinations for engineers, chemists, and technicians, many of whom had once served the Reich. Their arrival was not heralded with fanfare, but the impact was quietly profound. Technology and strategy were advanced in ways that would shape the next decade, even as the moral questions remained unspoken. The hunters who had compiled meticulous lists of the guilty felt a quiet frustration. How could the same individuals they sought for justice now be welcomed in distant labs? Yet even in disappointment, the rules of survival and politics were undeniable. The world had moved into a new configuration, one where memory and morality would sometimes yield to necessity. And beneath the hum of machinery, the tension between justice and progress persisted like a faint pulse. For the men themselves, this transition was complex and often silent. Some claimed remorse, speaking quietly of past actions to trusted colleagues. Others carried memories like shadows, refusing to speak unless asked. They adapted to their new surroundings, learning new languages, new routines, new loyalties. The world outside their offices and laboratories seldom questioned who they had been. And for a time even justice seemed to rest, waiting for a moment when it could catch up. Yet survivors, investigators, and historians kept fragments of recognition alive, knowing that knowledge could not erase truth. Every technical achievement was quietly weighed against a past that refused to vanish. And as rockets and engines roared to life, the echoes of history lingered softly in the halls. The tension between science and morality extended beyond laboratories. Governments debated quietly, balancing the pursuit of knowledge with ethical unease. Meetings behind closed doors decided fates not with verdicts, but with compromise. Some papers were stamped classified, others destroyed or edited, as if erasing history could make it lighter. Investigators found their work slowed or interrupted, yet their commitment remained unwavering. They knew that truth had a patience of its own, and that even hidden names could eventually surface. The quiet bargains made sense to the powerful, but they never removed the weight of responsibility. And so a paradox formed: progress built on knowledge, and knowledge built on the shadow of what could not be forgiven. And across continents, the world learned to walk delicately between promise and memory. Even the public remained largely unaware. Newspapers spoke of technological advancement, new missiles, and aviation feats. Few understood the origins of these innovations nor the moral compromises behind them. In quiet homes, survivors occasionally recognized faces or names, feeling a shiver of remembrance that they could not explain aloud. Investigators continued their work, gathering fragments of truth, even as nations pursued the future. The tension was invisible but persistent, a low, steady hum beneath the optimism of reconstruction. Education, industry, and defense were thriving, yet shadows of the past stretched long, and those who remembered the camps knew that history cannot be paused, even when governments choose to look away, and so justice was quietly postponed, waiting patiently for its moment in the sun. Historians would later reflect on this period as one of delicate balance, knowledge, and morality intertwined in a quiet, uneasy dance. The hunters of the past recognized that they were no longer simply tracking individuals, they were witnessing the world's attempt to reconcile memory with ambition. Some hunted with renewed vigilance, determined that no scientist's expertise could erase their accountability. Others documented quietly, understanding that time itself might reveal the truth. And the men who had once fled justice lived lives of achievement, shadowed by histories they could not fully erase. The earth moved, seasons changed, and yet the faint whisper of memory persisted across oceans and borders. And slowly, the first threads of reckoning began to reach beyond laboratories and offices. By the mid-1950s, the dual realities of Operation Paperclip were clear. Some former Nazis became architects of progress, while others remained wanted fugitives on paper. The moral compromise was a gentle, persistent shadow across governments and institutions. Yet the hunters had not stopped. Their work continued quietly, patiently, following faint traces wherever they appeared. In the quiet corridors of research and industry, the past lingered, a reminder that knowledge carries responsibility as much as power. The world had chosen sides, and in choosing, justice was deferred, but not denied. As the world chose sides, justice was quietly postponed, and the hunt for the hidden would quietly resume, patient as the wind across a winter landscape. In the autumn of 1945, a quiet city in Bavaria held a kind of hushed anticipation that seemed almost ceremonial. Nuremberg, scarred by conflict, had become a place of reckoning, where rubble met marble and memory met law. Lawyers, judges, and clerks moved with careful deliberation, their footsteps echoing softly through corridors lined with stacks of meticulously prepared documents. The defendants, once powerful, now waited in silence, their faces a study in shadow and reflection. Each piece of evidence, every photograph, every ledger was treated with gentle reverence, as if paper and ink could weigh the scales of morality. The world watched quietly, knowing that something unprecedented was unfolding, a trial not only of actions but of conscience. Witnesses were summoned, many of them survivors, who carried their memories with slow, deliberate care. They spoke softly, their words weaving a tapestry of human experience through the orderly calm of the courtroom, and in the rhythm of testimony and counsel, justice began its measured dance. And for the first time, law and memory walked together into the light. The prosecutors approached their work with a careful, almost meditative precision. Each argument was constructed patiently, supported by evidence gathered from across continents and archives. Documents were translated, compared, and verified, ensuring that each claim could bear the weight of history. They understood that this was more than litigation. It was a record for humanity itself. The defendants, once architects of terror, faced words that held them accountable, not with violence, but with reason and memory. Observers noted the quiet dignity in the presentation of facts, the steady cadence of logic meeting recollection. Every question asked, every pause allowed, gave space for reflection, for the past to be remembered with clarity. The courtroom became a place where meticulous thought and moral responsibility intertwined, and with each careful argument, the boundaries of justice were quietly extended. The judges, drawn from multiple nations, carried a calm weight upon their shoulders. They were tasked with interpreting not only law but ethics, recognizing that precedent could scarcely prepare them for this moment. Their deliberations were slow and thoughtful, each decision considered under the soft glow of lamps in the evening hours. They listened to witnesses whose memories shimmered like distant horizons, fragments of truth stretched across time and space. Defense attorneys, too, moved with quiet rigor, ensuring that the principles of fairness endured even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The balance of calm reasoning and moral gravity filled the air, creating a rhythm that was almost meditative. This was a trial in which humanity itself seemed to pause, holding its breath as principles met reality. Every document filed, every testimony given, added a note to this slow symphony of judgment, and the world began to understand what it meant to measure guilt, not only in deeds but in conscience. Witnesses arrived from cities, towns, and camps, once thought lost to history. Their recollections were careful, deliberate, carried in tones softened by years of distance and reflection. They spoke of names, dates, and events with quiet clarity, offering fragments that could be pieced together with patience. Survivors' faces, marked by both sorrow and endurance, conveyed stories that words alone could not hold. Every statement became a thread in a web of accountability, delicate yet persistent. The lawyers guided them gently, allowing pauses and moments of thought to stretch into meaningful reflection. Each uttered memory, no matter how small, contributed to the mosaic of evidence that would shape both verdict and memory. And as testimony flowed, the room felt suspended between past and present, history unfolding in measured, respectful cadence. And in that unfolding, the idea of universal justice became tangible for the first time. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath in solidarity with the proceedings. Light filtered softly through tall windows, casting shadows that moved slowly across benches and desks. Paper rustled quietly, footsteps echoed in gentle intervals, and voices rose and fell in measured patterns. Even the silence was filled with weight, the kind of presence that makes one aware of the gravity of listening. Lawyers read aloud from documents, witnesses repeated names that might otherwise have been forgotten, and judges noted every detail with calm, deliberate attention. The process was unhurried, almost ceremonial, transforming memory into law with quiet precision. And the world watching from beyond the walls absorbed the profound quiet of order confronting chaos. And in the soft cadence of procedure, morality began to find its voice. The defendants sat with varied expressions, some still proud, some withdrawn, some marked by quiet apprehension. Their past authority was reduced to careful observation and waiting. Each day, as testimony unfolded, the weight of memory pressed gently upon them, measured not in anger, but in reasoned clarity. Letters, photographs, and lists were laid out like lanterns in a dark room, illuminating truths they could not deny. Even the smallest details mattered. The recording of a date, a location, a command given or obeyed. Through meticulous accumulation, the courtroom became a space in which history could not hide, where documentation met reflection, and morality met law. And though the process was long, and the verdicts not yet rendered, every act of quiet diligence edged the world closer to recognition. And through this recognition, the first lessons of accountability were imparted to generations yet to come. As weeks turned into months, the trial revealed its slow, inevitable rhythm. Lawyers argued, witnesses recalled, and the room seemed to pulse gently with awareness. Observers noted the balance between formality and human connection, between procedure and empathy. The prosecutor's calm reasoning met the defendant's quiet defiance, while judges maintained a steady presence, neither rushed nor impatient. The dignity of the courtroom, its careful attention to detail, created a space in which truth could emerge unhurriedly. Even the pauses, the moments when silence hung over testimony, were filled with meaning. Justice was not a rush toward conclusion, but a patient gathering of evidence, reflection, and moral weight. And through each measured step, the trial transcended its immediate context, becoming a quiet statement for all humanity. And for the first time, the conscience of the world seemed to take deliberate, audible shape. By the time the verdicts were delivered, Nuremberg had become more than a city. It was a quiet monument to reason, reflection, and accountability. The sentences themselves were calm, deliberate, and measured, reflecting the gravity of history rather than the need for spectacle. Lawyers, witnesses, and judges alike left the courtroom knowing that they had participated in an unprecedented act of moral clarity. Memory had become law, and law had honored memory with the utmost care. The world had witnessed the first moment in history when conscience itself was given a seat at the table, speaking softly, insistently, without interruption. And though the war had ended years before, justice had now found a way to begin. For the first time in history, conscience itself took the stand, and the quiet echoes of its testimony would ripple across decades to come. Even as the world rebuilt, some who had once wielded power in shadow moved quietly through the ruins. The continent itself seemed to hold them, offering hidden routes beneath mountains and through silent valleys. Monasteries and remote villages became resting points, places where history's fugitives could pause without drawing attention. Guides, both willing and coerced, whispered directions across fields and forests. Papers were forged with care, identities reassembled from fragments of memory and necessity. Ships and trains awaited those who could move unnoticed, carrying them slowly toward distant horizons. The network was neither large nor well documented at first, but it was persistent, threading its way through a Europe still soft with recovery. Each escape was a secret pulse in a continent-wide rhythm, subtle yet steady. And in these movements, a quiet mystery began to gather, unseen by most and feared by few. The ratlines were often improvised, adapting to obstacles with a patience born of necessity. Routes through Italy and Austria connected to ports, where travel to South America became possible. Those guiding the fugitives knew the landscape intimately. Forests, hills, and valleys that could conceal footsteps for days. Safe houses appeared in small towns, often offered by sympathizers or those whose motivations were complex and hidden. Food and money were exchanged quietly, sometimes in small inns or abandoned farmhouses, always with the awareness of passing eyes. Letters and coded messages carried instructions, timing and reassurance across borders. Investigators would later marvel at the subtle efficiency of these networks, the way human ingenuity could work in shadow. Yet for the fugitives themselves, each step was a careful negotiation between hope and the constant weight of memory. And the paths they followed would ripple quietly through the next decades of pursuit. The clergy, knowingly or unknowingly, played a quiet role in the movement of men across Europe. In cloisters and monasteries, rooms were offered, meals provided, doors closed against inquiry. These sanctuaries were not always motivated by sympathy alone. Some were caught between ideology, fear, and the desire to help the lost survive. The fugitives learned the rhythm of these spaces, understanding which doors would open and which would remain silent. Travel documents, sometimes official, sometimes fabricated, were passed along with care, as if paper itself could bear the weight of memory. The world outside was rebuilding, yet inside these narrow corridors, the past remained alive and moving. Every step of the journey required patience, trust, and quiet observation, and with each crossing, the Ratlines wove an intricate, almost invisible tapestry of escape. Survivors and investigators began to notice patterns in the disappearances. Names reappeared far from Europe, in cities that had seemed untouched by war. South America, in particular, became a distant horizon where fugitives sought refuge. Letters and tips reached law enforcement slowly, often months or years after the fact. The networks were careful, layering false identities and safe havens, making pursuit arduous and uncertain. Yet the hunters of memory persisted, gathering fragments, piecing together paths from the scattered clues that emerged. Even when the trails seemed cold, the persistence of memory kept the pursuit alive. Each lead, no matter how faint, became a lantern, illuminating a shadowed landscape. And in this gradual illumination, the first whispers of justice began to stretch across continents. Life along the Ratlines was quiet and tense. Each day a careful balance of movement and concealment. Fugitives learned the cadence of trains and ships, the rhythm of towns and borders. Every interaction required subtlety, every gesture weighed for potential exposure. Guides and helpers often lived in parallel worlds, serving both survival and secrecy. Money and food were exchanged with a delicate tact, always mindful of observation. Each crossing was a meditation on risk and patience, where even a whisper could alter the path. The fugitives carried memories like silent companions, shadowing their footsteps across valleys and coastlines, and the landscape itself, mountains and rivers alike, became part of their secret passage. And so the Ratlines continued, moving quietly beneath the hum of a recovering world. Investigators working from offices in Germany, Austria, and Italy began to sketch the outlines of these networks. Reports were cross-referenced, testimonies compared, and missing persons lists carefully consulted. Each fragment of evidence became part of a delicate lattice, hinting at routes that were otherwise invisible. Tracking was painstaking. Months could pass between sightings or confirmations. Yet the dedication of the hunters never wavered, for they understood that every step of the network carried names that must not be forgotten. Observers far away in South America occasionally confirmed details. Often decades later, patient, quiet observation and the methodical collection of fragments became their tools. And through their persistent diligence, the hidden arteries of escape slowly began to reveal themselves. The Ratlines were a study in human ingenuity and human risk. Every decision to move, every path chosen, was layered with uncertainty. Safe houses, sympathetic officials, and distant ports formed a fragile lattice of opportunity and concealment. Yet even in these clandestine movements, small moments of grace appeared. A kind word from a stranger, a meal offered without expectation, a quiet night under a starlit horizon. The fugitives moved with care, aware of the invisible eyes of history. Investigators followed, sometimes years behind, tracing echoes of footprints across oceans. In the gaps between action and observation, patience became the quiet instrument of justice. And as these stories unfolded, the threads of pursuit began to stretch further than the fugitives ever imagined. By the early 1950s, the Ratlines had established routes that spanned continents, carrying men who had once wielded influence into new and distant lands. South America became a distant sanctuary. a horizon across which Europe's shadows quietly travelled. Governments, investigators, and survivors slowly began to piece together the evidence of these escapes, often decades after the journeys themselves. The world's attention shifted and wavered, yet the persistence of memory never faltered. Every list, every clue, every name carried the quiet insistence that the past would not be lost. And for those dedicated to tracing these paths, patience became both virtue and method. They called them ratlines, narrow veins through which history's poison flowed, and the quiet hunt for their travellers would continue, stretching slowly across oceans and time. Even as Europe rebuilt, rumours began to circulate in quiet circles, whispers carried through corridors of power and intelligence, names of men who had vanished from official records surfaced in letters, reports, and conversations, suggesting networks larger than previously imagined. One such name was Odessa, said to be an organization dedicated to helping former Nazis escape and disappear. The truth of its existence remained blurred, a mixture of fact, conjecture, and myth, but it was enough to draw attention. Investigators listened carefully to every fragment, knowing that even rumor could contain a grain of guidance. Paths that had once been open in Italy, Germany, and Austria now seemed connected by invisible threads. Codes were exchanged in shadows, discreet instructions guiding those who were already far from the reach of conventional law. And in the quiet persistence of these traces, the concept of a coordinated network began to take shape. And so the hunt turned toward tracing not just individuals, but the shadows of organization itself. The Vatican, with its quiet corridors and centuries of secrecy, became a focal point in the hunt. Travel documents and letters, some routine, some suspect, occasionally hinted at the movement of individuals through Rome. Investigators pursued these hints with care, balancing respect for institutions with the need to trace history's fugitives. Monasteries and convents along the route were quietly checked for anomalies, signs of visitors who should not have been there. Even the simplest details, a passport stamp, a hotel ledger, a delayed train, were noted with meticulous attention. The fugitives relied on these subtle gaps and soft shadows to navigate across borders, and the hunters, patient and deliberate, began to map these shadows into patterns. Through this careful observation, the invisible highways of escape slowly came into focus. Argentina, with its distant horizon and open policies, became a final destination for many seeking sanctuary. Letters from contacts, reports from returning investigators, and occasional eyewitness accounts painted a portrait of a land welcoming to those with pasts best left unexamined. Cities like Buenos Aires quietly received the exiles, blending them into communities of ordinary life. Streets and cafes became arenas of subtle observation, where the past met the present in quiet intersections. For survivors and hunters, these distant lands were a reminder that justice could stretch far beyond the borders of Europe. Communication with local authorities was slow and often unreliable, requiring patience, repeated verification, and careful record-keeping. Every confirmed sighting became a small victory, illuminating paths once thought entirely hidden. And as these trails emerged, a gentle tension rose, carrying the promise of discovery. Odessa, whether real or partially imagined, became a symbol of both fear and determination. The idea of coordinated help gave structure to otherwise scattered sightings and reports. Investigators began to trace connections, meetings, letters, and assistance offered across borders, looking for a pattern in the faint signals. The myth and the fact intertwined, creating a quiet, almost hypnotic puzzle for those who followed it. Every clue was weighed, compared, and filed, like small lanterns lighting a vast shadowed landscape. Rumors, when corroborated even partially, were enough to spark investigation, and with each step the hunters realized that the pursuit was as much about understanding human networks as it was about finding individuals, and in the interplay of rumor and evidence, the first outlines of a shadowed organization began to emerge. Travelers and informants became critical sources of subtle insight. Witnesses spoke softly of people seen arriving, departing, and moving between cities with careful purpose. Each recollection was treated delicately, verified against documents, and cross-referenced across borders. Investigators learned to listen not just to words, but to pauses, inflections, and hesitations, all carrying quiet meaning. Letters and coded communications, sometimes months or years old, were examined for consistency and hidden patterns. The patience required was immense, yet each confirmation became a gentle pulse of progress. In this slow rhythm, the contours of escape routes and hidden networks took shape. And as these patterns coalesced, the scope of the hunt expanded beyond Europe's horizon. The network of escape, real or imagined, created a sense of both urgency and fascination among hunters. Even as men were documented in distant lands, investigators remained attentive to the soft signals that suggested coordination. They understood that movement was subtle, not dramatic, but deliberate and cautious. Safe houses, sympathetic officials, and quiet intermediaries made the paths elusive but not invisible. Reports filtered slowly, some arriving decades later, yet each was treated with meticulous care. Even the faintest trail could lead to a breakthrough, and no detail was dismissed as irrelevant. And the quiet web of connections stretched ever further, tracing shadows over mountains, seas, and continents. The human dimension of this pursuit was never forgotten. Survivors and witnesses carried memory like a lantern, offering guidance that maps and papers could not provide. Their stories moved investigators slowly, deliberately, teaching them to read between words and gestures. Patience became both method and meditation, and observation became a form of reverence. The ratlines and the whispers of Odessa were not only networks of escape, they were proof of the persistence of memory, the traces that linger even when history tries to vanish. Every confirmed path, every document verified, felt like a small reclamation of truth, and through this the quiet hunt continued, tracing faint outlines that would eventually converge with justice. By the mid-1950s, whispers of Odessa and its shadowed routes had become a mosaic of clues and confirmed sightings. Europe remained a continent of recovery, but beyond its borders, the story of fugitives persisted quietly in distant lands. Investigators, hunters, and survivors continued to trace every signal with gentle patience, understanding that time and distance were not barriers but tools of perspective. Maps were drawn, reports compiled, and the faint threads of escape were slowly illuminated. Each new discovery, however small, offered reassurance that memory could not be erased entirely. In whispers and coded letters, the hunters began to trace the trail, and the shadows of Rome and Buenos Aires alike were slowly brought into the soft light of understanding. In the quiet of Vienna, Simon Wiesenthal worked among towers of files that seemed to grow taller with each passing day. The office was still yet alive with the faint rustle of paper and the soft scratch of pen on parchment. Each document carried names, dates, and places, fragments of lives disrupted, of cruelty remembered, of justice yet to be fulfilled. He moved through them slowly, deliberately, as if each page demanded careful attention. The world outside rebuilt and moved on, But inside this room, memory was kept alive. His desk, cluttered yet ordered, became a sanctuary where time itself seemed to pause. He cross-referenced lists, interviewed survivors, and followed leads that spanned continents. Every success was quiet, measured, and without fanfare, yet each step carried weight. And through this careful patience, the pulse of justice continued to beat softly in the background. Wiesenthal understood the weight of his work, both morally and emotionally. Each name in his files represented not only a potential fugitive, but also a story, a memory, a fragment of history that could not be allowed to vanish. He spoke quietly to survivors, listening to recollections carried for years, filtering details with gentle precision. The process was slow, often frustrating, yet each small discovery built upon the last, creating a lattice of understanding. Occasionally, a new lead would arrive from another continent, hinting at someone who had slipped through the cracks. He treated every note with reverence, every letter as a fragment of a larger truth. His office became a quiet lighthouse, illuminating paths that had once been lost in darkness. And with every turn of a page, the map of justice stretched further across time and space. The office was modest, yet it contained the weight of history itself. Stacks of files leaned like gentle towers, each labeled with dates and names, reminders of those who had suffered and those who had fled. The light through the window fell softly on the papers, highlighting the edges of names written carefully by hand. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet diligence within. Wiesenthal's work was methodical, almost meditative, moving from file to file with patience and care. Even mistakes were lessons, guiding his approach toward greater accuracy. His persistence became a rhythm, steady and unhurried, carrying him through years of research and correspondence. And the quiet accumulation of knowledge slowly became a map of memory that no one could erase. For Wiesenthal, every lead mattered, even those that seemed faint or implausible. Letters from distant witnesses, tips from sympathetic officials, and fragments of government records were all examined with deliberate care. He learned to notice subtle patterns, repeated names, recurring locations, and connections that were invisible at first glance. The work required patience, for months could pass without confirmation, and years without resolution. Yet even in these quiet pauses, he continued to listen, to read, and to gather fragments of truth. Each piece of evidence was treated with respect, each memory honored. The weight of responsibility never diminished. It shaped his days and guided his nights. And in the careful assembly of these fragments, the faint outlines of justice began to emerge. Visitors were few, and most of his work was done in solitude. The silence of the office became a companion, a space where thought could move without interruption. Survivors came occasionally, bringing new recollections that added depth and clarity to his investigations. He noted every detail, no matter how small, understanding that even a single name or date could change the course of a search. Patience was the essential tool, as each connection took time to verify. Maps, lists, and correspondences were methodically cross-checked, creating an intricate network of memory and evidence. And through the stillness, Wiesenthal's presence became both a reassurance and a gentle insistence that the past could not be forgotten. And in this quiet vigilance, the seeds of accountability slowly took root. The scale of the task never intimidated him, though it was immense. Each file represented a fragment of a world disrupted by war, a world in which memory was fragile and often contested. He approached the work with calm persistence, allowing time to reveal connections that might otherwise be overlooked. Names that once seemed lost would resurface, traced through letters, testimonies, or official records. Even in setbacks he remained steady, understanding that diligence over time was more powerful than haste. Every small breakthrough became a soft illumination in the otherwise shadowed landscape of post-war Europe. And through these quiet victories, the network of fugitives began to take shape in both memory and record. Wiesenthal's office was more than a workspace. It was a quiet archive of conscience. Each document, carefully preserved, carried not only factual information, but also the weight of human experience. His routine was slow and deliberate, a rhythm that mirrored the unfolding of history itself. Days were filled with correspondence, cross-checking leads, and arranging interviews with those whose recollections might unlock new paths. The accumulation of details, verified with care, created a form of quiet power, the power of truth preserved. Outside, the world hurried on, but within these walls time moved gently, shaped by the deliberate attention to memory. And as files multiplied, so too did the subtle reach of justice, stretching patiently across borders and years. By the early 1950s, Wiesenthal's work had begun to attract attention, though it remained largely silent and understated. Governments, investigators, and survivors recognized the importance of his meticulous record-keeping. Yet even as recognition grew, the work itself remained humble, slow, and deliberate. Each case pursued was a small assertion that history's memory could not be erased. And in this quiet, unrelenting dedication, one man became a conduit for the conscience of a continent. One man's memory became the conscience of a continent, and through his quiet diligence, the pursuit of justice continued, patient as the slow turning of the seasons. In the years following the war, Israel emerged from the ashes with a quiet determination to preserve memory and seek justice. Survivors carried their recollections across oceans and deserts, often whispered in small gatherings and letters. The newly formed intelligence services understood that some truths could not wait for courts to convene. They began to map the shadows, collecting names, locations, and rumors with meticulous care. Each lead, no matter how faint, was treated with respect, as if every detail could illuminate a long-hidden path. Agents worked quietly, relying on patience, observation, and an understanding that time could both conceal and reveal. The pursuit was methodical, deliberate, and imbued with a deep sense of responsibility. Every day brought subtle progress, even when the work seemed invisible to the world outside. And with each discovery, the threads of memory stretched slowly toward distant horizons. The operations were never loud or public. They moved in whispers, in letters and across discreet channels. Informants, survivors, and sympathetic witnesses offered fragments of knowledge that, when pieced together, formed delicate patterns. Safe houses, discreet meetings, and carefully verified reports became the rhythm of the hunt. Each operation required patience and precision, a quiet orchestration of timing and detail. The agents understood that the past lingered in the present, and that memory, when nurtured, could guide action even decades later. Every map, ledger, and photograph was a bridge between shadowed continents and the light of accountability. And though success was often incremental, it carried immense weight, affirming the importance of persistence and conscience. And in this gentle, steady pursuit, the echoes of history began to converge on the paths of the guilty. Hunting fugitives meant navigating landscapes that had long forgotten their footsteps. Streets, ports, and distant towns were examined with careful attention to subtle irregularities. Agents listened to whispers, observed routines, and traced patterns that seemed almost invisible to others. Every detail, a missing passport, a delayed letter, a familiar accent, became a clue in the quiet puzzle of pursuit. Survivors' recollections were consulted repeatedly, not as testimony in court, but as guides through time and memory. Patience became the most essential instrument. The agents understood that the smallest detail could eventually unravel decades of concealment. The process demanded both reflection and focus, and a steady awareness of the human dimension behind each lead. And slowly the contours of hidden networks began to emerge, stretching from Europe to distant lands across the globe. Operations were coordinated with discretion, respecting both the fragility of witnesses and the difficulty of tracking those who had disappeared. Reports flowed quietly through offices in Tel Aviv and safe houses abroad, each verified, compared, and filed. The agents moved like careful currents beneath the surface of ordinary life, unseen but persistent. Each observation and correspondence built upon the last, gradually revealing connections once thought lost. Names that had vanished from official records reappeared in patterns that could be traced, documented, and eventually confronted. Even as governments and institutions hesitated, these quiet pursuers pressed forward with a sense of unspoken urgency, and with each piece of evidence the invisible map of justice expanded steadily, guided by memory rather than force. And in the patient weaving of these threads, the hunters found a quiet rhythm that could span continents and decades. The work was as much moral as it was practical. Each operation carried the weight of remembrance, the obligation to honor those who could no longer speak. Agents treated information with care, understanding that even small errors could erase opportunities or compromise lives. Maps, photographs, and notes became instruments of conscience, tools to reclaim history from obscurity. The faint trails of fugitives were pursued with soft persistence, guided by evidence and intuition alike. Each discovery was a quiet affirmation that memory could endure, that accountability could be sought even when justice had been delayed. And though the work often moved slowly, it was deliberate, careful, and humane. And through this dedication, the invisible threads of pursuit stretched ever further, connecting past and present with quiet inevitability. In addition to careful observation, investigators relied on subtle human connections. Survivors, locals, and informants were interviewed repeatedly with patience and empathy. Their recollections, sometimes hesitant or fragmentary, carried the weight of decades. Each memory was treated as a key, capable of unlocking paths that had been concealed by geography and time. Even distant cities and continents were mapped and cross-referenced, as if every whisper of information could illuminate a hidden corridor. The agent's approach was measured and reflective, ensuring that no detail, however faint, was lost. And through these efforts, the outlines of fugitives' movements became tangible, like soft shadows tracing the contours of memory itself. And the pursuit, quiet yet relentless, pressed forward beneath the surface of a world unaware. The legacy of the Mossad's early hunts was built on patience and persistence. Every operation was guided by a sense of moral purpose, an understanding that the past could not be ignored. Time and distance were navigated with careful planning, and even the faintest lead was pursued until it could be verified. The quiet work of documentation, observation, and subtle inquiry slowly accumulated into a powerful record. As fugitives were traced across continents, investigators maintained a steady rhythm, never rushed, always attentive. And with each small success, the broader mission, the reclamation of memory and the pursuit of accountability, advanced quietly but steadily. And in this long memory, the past began to converge with the present, guiding the course of justice with gentle insistence. By the mid-1950s, the foundations of the Mossad's quiet pursuit were firmly established. Leads stretched across Europe, South America, and beyond, mapping the journeys of those who had fled justice. Investigators, guided by conscience and memory, continued to follow every whisper and faint trail. Each recovered path was a soft illumination in a world still rebuilding from war, a reminder that time could not erase responsibility. And though some names remained elusive, the methodical, patient pursuit continued, a testament to human determination and quiet perseverance. Some hunts were done not for law, but for the lost, and in their careful, deliberate pursuit, the shadows of the past began to align with the light of accountability. In the soft haze of Buenos Aires evening, the city seemed ordinary, almost indifferent to the weight of history moving within its streets. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of atrocities, lived quietly among neighbors who knew him only by a different name. Life outside continued in the gentle rhythm of footsteps and distant traffic, yet inside a meticulous operation was quietly unfolding. Messages crossed continents, coded and cautious, connecting agents with patience and precision. Each movement was calculated, deliberate, as though the very air held the memory of those who would not speak again. The city's shadows provided cover, softening the edges of waiting and observation. Agents watched from quiet perches, recording comings and goings, timing routines with careful attention. Months of investigation had narrowed the options, revealing patterns invisible to casual eyes. And beneath the tranquil hum of city life, justice prepared to move in silence. The operation demanded coordination, a choreography of subtle gestures and shared understanding. Vehicles were chosen not for speed, but for discretion. Routes were mapped not for distance, but for quiet. Agents moved through alleys, sidewalks, and courtyards, observing without disturbing, listening without intrusion. Even the smallest anomaly, a door left slightly ajar, a figure standing unusually still, was noted with care. Each step was informed by intelligence gathered from documents, letters, and distant recollections of survivors. The work was methodical, almost meditative, relying on the patience of those who understood the weight of time and consequence. As night deepened, the city's ordinary sounds, wind in the trees, distant voices, soft traffic, became the rhythm of anticipation. And in this rhythm, the threads of careful observation converged on a single figure. Eichmann moved as he always did, unaware that the quiet eyes of history had found him. His routines were simple, measured, and repeated, which allowed the hunters to anticipate each step. The agents studied these patterns without interruption, noting every turn, every window, every possible route of escape. They waited with patient calm, letting time itself become a tool of observation. Every signal from afar was verified, every message double-checked, as though the smallest mistake could undo months of careful work. In the hush of streets and courtyards, the fugitive's world and the pursuer's world existed in close proximity yet separate. Silence became both shield and instrument, amplifying the subtle cadence of anticipation. And as shadows lengthened across the streets, the moment of confrontation quietly approached. The capture itself was a careful orchestration of precision and restraint. Agents moved like soft currents, unseen but inevitable, guiding Eichmann into a space where movement would no longer conceal him. Every gesture was deliberate, measured, and gentle, ensuring minimal risk while preserving the dignity of procedure. Time seemed to slow as they crossed streets and alleys, the night folding around them like a protective veil. Even in this critical moment, patience and calm ruled over haste and force. The city, with its distant hums and soft illumination, provided cover for the quiet act of justice. Notes and signals exchanged in whispered codes confirmed each stage of the operation. And under the Argentine dusk, justice moved in silence. Once in custody, Eichmann was treated with care, not for comfort, but for the integrity of the operation. Each movement was carefully planned to avoid detection, preserve evidence, and maintain a moral responsibility. Agents coordinated transport, timing, and observation, ensuring that the pursuit of justice remained disciplined and deliberate. Every step carried the weight of history, a reminder of the lives that had been lost, and the memory they demanded be preserved. Even the silence of a passing car or a distant voice was noted and accounted for. The city itself seemed to participate, allowing movement through its soft-lit streets without disruption. And in this quiet, the boundaries between law, morality, and memory converged. Back in temporary safe houses, the operation continued with patience and precision. Documents, photographs, and verifications were reviewed and cross-referenced. Communications traveled in coded channels, slow but reliable, confirming the path that history had carved for the operation. Every step reinforced the care with which the hunt had been conducted, a balance of efficiency, patience, and moral purpose. The atmosphere was subdued, each action deliberate, each decision weighed with thoughtfulness. Even the briefest pause became a moment of reflection, honoring both the survivors and the enormity of the pursuit. And in these quiet moments, the architecture of justice expanded gently yet inexorably. The capture of Eichmann was not a spectacle, but a quiet reclamation of history. The agents, guided by memory, patience, and skill, had bridged continents and decades in order to bring him to account. Their work was slow, careful, and deliberate, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. The fugitive's past could not remain hidden, and the persistence of the hunters ensured that justice, however delayed, was achievable. Even the faintest echoes of their steps resonated with significance, carrying the memory of those who had been silenced. And as Eichmann's life in hiding came to its quiet end, the operation stood as a testament to methodical determination, moral responsibility, and the enduring weight of conscience. And across oceans and generations, the pursuit of memory pressed forward. The aftermath of the operation rippled gently but firmly across the world. News traveled slowly, verified carefully before release, and the lessons of patience, precision, and quiet determination became a model for future hunts. The capture of Eichmann was not merely an event, but a statement that even the most carefully hidden shadows could not evade history indefinitely. Survivors, investigators, and distant observers alike felt the weight of accomplishment, calm but undeniable. The streets of Buenos Aires returned to their ordinary rhythm, but the operation's quiet triumph lingered in the soft hum of the city. Under the Argentine dusk, justice moved in silence, and in that silence, the world learned the quiet power of relentless, patient pursuit. In Jerusalem, the world gathered quietly before screens and radios following a trial that was unlike any other. Adolf Eichmann, once a man of shadow and escape, now faced the measured gaze of law and conscience. Survivors, their faces carrying decades of memory, spoke with calm deliberation, their words weaving a tapestry of lives interrupted and stolen. The courtroom became a space of quiet revelation, where testimony served as both evidence and remembrance. Each story softly recounted carried weight far beyond its immediate moment, echoing across continents and decades. Lawyers and judges moved deliberately, balancing procedure with the human urgency that filled the room. Even those who watched from afar felt the gentle gravity of each account, the resonance of voices long silenced now given space. And as the trial unfolded, the ordinary streets of Jerusalem seemed to hum with the quiet presence of history itself. Eichmann appeared unremarkable, a man shaped by routine and habit, Yet the evidence traced the extraordinary consequences of his actions. The contrast between the ordinariness of his demeanor and the enormity of his deeds created a tension that was palpable yet calm. Witnesses recounted experiences that stretched across Europe, each account measured, deliberate, and full of quiet courage. The rhythm of the proceedings allowed the world to absorb these memories gradually, without rush, honoring the slow persistence of reflection. Every question, answer, and pause became part of a larger meditation on accountability and human morality. The soft weight of testimony built a bridge between the past and the present, connecting personal grief with collective understanding. And in the rhythm of this quiet revelation, the trial became a meditation on memory itself. Television brought these voices into homes far from Jerusalem, softening distance while amplifying the gravity of events. Ordinary citizens, many who had never experienced war firsthand, listened and watched as survivors recounted their journeys. The courtroom's calm deliberation contrasted with the invisible tumult of memory carried by those who spoke. Each narrative was a quiet assertion that history could not be erased, that the lives lost demanded acknowledgement. Even in the soft cadence of testimony, the enormity of loss and resilience was palpable. Lawyers, prosecutors, and the accused moved in measured steps, careful to preserve dignity while revealing truth. The quiet pace allowed viewers to follow, reflect, and absorb, creating a shared space of moral contemplation. And as each witness spoke, the invisible ledger of memory expanded, filling gaps left by silence and absence. The trial was a lesson in the ordinary mechanics of evil, but also in the extraordinary endurance of human memory. Names, places, and dates were traced with careful attention, each detail forming a lattice of accountability. Survivors described the rhythms of daily life under oppression, the subtle gestures, the quiet acts of courage, the losses felt in muted spaces. Each recollection was a ripple, extending across the courtroom and far beyond, connecting the personal to the universal. The proceedings moved deliberately, never rushed, creating a gentle unfolding of history for all to witness. Even Eichmann's demeanor, calm and composed, revealed through contrast the weight of the testimonies surrounding him. And in the quiet cadence of the trial, the world began to learn the profound resonance of memory and moral clarity. Judges and lawyers approached their roles with measured care, aware that the trial carried lessons far beyond the courtroom. Every ruling, question, and review of evidence was done with a steady hand, ensuring that justice was patient and principled. Witnesses were treated with respect, their memories honored, their narratives allowed to unfold without interruption. The slow rhythm of proceedings mirrored the careful accumulation of evidence, creating a sense of deliberate calm. Outside, streets hummed with ordinary life, yet inside, history's pulse was audible in the quiet articulation of facts and recollections. Each testimony became a meditation on human resilience, a gentle assertion that memory itself could act as witness. And as the days passed, the trial's lessons extended beyond law, reaching into conscience and collective reflection. Observers noted the unusual power of ordinary gestures in the courtroom. A measured pause, the careful reading of a document, the quiet gaze of a witness. These movements, small yet intentional, carried the weight of decades of history. The trial's calm cadence allowed viewers distant and near to reflect on the ordinary structures that had enabled extraordinary harm. Each piece of evidence, every recollection, became a thread connecting the past with moral responsibility in the present. The world learnt slowly, absorbing the lessons with a gentle patience that mirrored the persistence of memory itself, and the quiet authority of the proceedings offered reassurance that justice, even delayed, was attainable. And in this quiet convergence of memory and law, the ordinary became a lens for understanding the extraordinary. The Eichmann trial was not merely an event. It was a sustained meditation on human conscience. Survivors' voices, measured and deliberate, rose above the passage of years, transforming absence into presence. The procedural calm of the courtroom created space for reflection, allowing history to unfold gently but firmly. Each witness, by recalling moments of loss and endurance, became a guide through time, bridging gaps between continents, generations, and memory itself. Even those who only observed from afar could sense the gravity, the delicate weight of acknowledgement and moral reckoning. The trial demonstrated that the ordinary rhythms of law could carry the extraordinary responsibility of remembrance. And in these moments, the world learned that evil could look ordinary and still be absolute. As the trial drew toward its conclusion, the quiet intensity of the proceedings remained undiminished. Judgments were rendered with careful deliberation, evidence and testimony weighed with patience and moral attention. The voices of survivors, softly yet insistently, became permanent markers in the world's collective memory. The trial was a bridge, connecting the lessons of history with the present, reminding all that reflection and justice could coexist in calm persistence. Eichmann's fate, determined through measured process, underscored the reach of accountability across time and space. And though the courtroom emptied, the echoes of testimony lingered, gentle and resonant. The world learned that evil could look ordinary and still be absolute. And in that understanding, the quiet pursuit of justice moved forward, patient and unwavering. In the wake of Eichmann's capture, the world's attention often drifted from those who remained hidden. Joseph Mengele, Martin Bormann, and others moved in quiet obscurity. Their lives folded into ordinary towns and distant countrysides. Rumors followed them like shadows, whispers of sightings in remote villages, fleeting traces in travel records, small hints that faded as quickly as they appeared. Investigators sifted through these traces patiently, aware that certainty was rare and time both concealed and revealed. The fugitives' paths were often circuitous, passing through continents, over rivers, and across borders softened by distance. Each disappearance carried the weight of myth, as stories accumulated around absence and uncertainty. The world watched quietly, understanding that for every captured figure, others continued to elude the reach of justice. And through these quiet absences, the memory of the hunted lingered like a soft echo across years. Mengel's trail carried him through the landscapes of South America, a life marked by careful concealment and muted observation. He adopted names, blended into communities, and relied on networks both loyal and fearful. Yet even in his quietude, traces emerged: travel documents, correspondences, occasional recollections from those who glimpsed him in passing. Hunters and historians pieced together fragments, aware that certainty would be slow and partial. Bormann moved in a different rhythm, disappearing into the folds of Europe's rural and urban expanse. His movements were calculated, deliberate, leaving minimal footprints for pursuers to follow. Each disappearance added to a sense of narrative tension, the space between myth and reality filling with quiet speculation. And in the absence of confirmed sightings, the shadows of these men stretched across continents like gentle, elusive threads. Muller too drifted through time and geography, surviving in hidden corners of Europe, while the world continued its reconstruction. Reports arrived sporadically: a brief sighting, a name mentioned in a letter, a rumor circulating among local authorities. Investigators learned to measure these traces carefully, knowing that each could be both misleading and illuminating. Patience became the central tool, as months and years unfolded slowly, revealing subtle consistencies amid the noise. Even when traces faded, the persistence of memory, of survivors, of documents, of informal networks offered faint, guiding light. The landscape of disappearance became a quiet study in human resilience and concealment. And with each rumor that lingered, the world was reminded that justice was often patient, moving beneath the surface of ordinary life. The fugitive commanders lived under layers of assumed normalcy, blending into daily routines while the past shadowed every movement. Letters, small transactions, and occasional acquaintances became silent markers for those who sought them. Historians and hunters approached these traces like soft currents, following gentle inclinations and quiet hints rather than forceful evidence. Each disappearance was a meditation in absence, requiring both reflection and meticulous care. Rumors of sightings and improbable encounters spread slowly, sometimes dissipating into local folklore, other times persisting in quiet reports across continents. And yet for every trace there was a small revelation, a document, a photograph, or a memory that hinted at hidden continuity. And in the subtle layering of these fragments, the outlines of history's absences began to take form. As decades passed, the elusive commanders' names became intertwined with myth, their quiet movements filling spaces where memory strained against forgetting. Generations of investigators and curious minds followed fragments, building intricate networks of possibility from sparse evidence. Each clue demanded patience, a slow consideration of time, geography, and human behavior. Even distant recollections, a neighbor's recollection, an official's note, an anecdotal letter, were treated as part of a delicate, unfolding puzzle. The tension between certainty and speculation was soft but persistent, guiding the careful work of remembrance. And in this rhythm, history itself seemed to whisper, reminding all that absence is also a form of presence. And for every man caught, another vanished into rumor. The quiet deaths of some fugitives eventually brought closure, though often far from public view. In remote towns or isolated homes, life ended with little ceremony, leaving traces only in official records or whispered local accounts. Investigators slowly confirmed these endings, reconciling absence with reality in careful, deliberate steps. The passage of time transformed uncertainty into knowledge, and myth into soft certainty. Even so, the lingering stories continued to shape memory, blending factual outcomes with the narratives that had grown around concealment. The world gradually absorbed these endings, reflecting on the persistence of evasion and the slow, patient arrival of truth. And in each quiet resolution, the contours of justice stretched gently across years and continents. The vanished commanders became symbols of the tension between memory and disappearance, between the weight of history and the soft currents of rumor. Their lives, hidden yet faintly visible, reminded the world that accountability is rarely immediate, and that patience is as much a part of justice as action. Hunters and historians moved quietly, following subtle trails and honoring fragments of testimony. Each thread was preserved, not to sensationalize, but to maintain the continuity of historical memory. Even absence spoke volumes, teaching the attentive observer about the persistence of time, the reach of conscience, and the careful mapping of hidden lives. And the quiet expanse of rumor became its own kind of testimony, tracing paths that records alone could not illuminate. By the late 20th century, the myths and traces of Mengele, Bormann, and Müller had largely converged into history's record. Some endings were quietly confirmed, others remained shadowed, yet the pursuit itself had transformed collective understanding. Investigators, journalists, and historians had traced years of absence with patience, care, and gentle diligence. The vanished men left behind stories that were less about spectacle and more about reflection, memory, and the patient work of truth. Their quiet concealment, their fading presence, and the persistence of their hunters became a meditation on time and responsibility. For every man caught, another vanished into rumor, and in that space between certainty and myth, history continued its quiet unfolding, patient as a slow horizon. The jungles of South America held a quiet, almost hypnotic menace. Stretching across rivers and dense foliage, hunters moved carefully, guided by maps, letters, and fleeting memories from faraway survivors. Every footstep pressed into soft earth, carrying both hope and caution. The air was heavy with humidity, the wind carrying distant bird calls and the whisper of leaves. Local communities often knew only fragments of the newcomers' intentions, offering small clues or guarded silence. Each village and town brought a new puzzle, a subtle trace of someone who should have been long gone. False leads abounded, stories mingling truth with myth, creating a careful dance between patience and persistence. Investigators learned to trust rhythm and observation, noting even the faintest anomaly in daily routines. And in every small-town bar, there was a face that looked too familiar. Hunters relied on discretion, moving through markets, river crossings, and quiet plazas without drawing attention. They spoke softly, exchanged letters with coded notes, and listened with patience for details that might go unnoticed. Each informant's account was a thread, fragile yet vital, weaving a map of hidden presences. Betrayal was a subtle hazard, a misremembered name, a cautious neighbor, a misleading lead, requiring careful interpretation. Agents balanced urgency with reflection, understanding that rushing could close doors that time might otherwise open. They learned to let the landscape guide them, noticing patterns of travel, trade, and migration that suggested concealment. The jungle, with its soft noises and dense canopies, seemed almost alive, absorbing movement and muffling sound. And each quiet observation brought them closer to lives that had slipped between continents and decades. Letters from informants arrived sporadically, often delayed by distance or suspicion, carrying fragments of memory across borders. Hunters would gather these notes, compare them, and trace pathways in careful sequence. Even the smallest detail, a color of a roof, a local custom, a remembered accent, could illuminate months of searching. Each day was a meditation in persistence, where the rhythm of the hunt was slow and deliberate. Occasionally a breakthrough would emerge, a fleeting acknowledgement, a hint of recognition, a piece of a puzzle falling into place. The soft rustle of leaves and distant animal calls became companions in the patient work of reconstruction. Agents moved without hurry, guided by a quiet intuition born of careful study and historical knowledge. And in the tropical silence, every whisper of information felt amplified, carrying significance across miles of jungle and city alike. False leads often tested both patience and resolve, demanding a gentle recalibration of approach. A local who had seen someone resembling a fugitive might lead to weeks of quiet observation with no confirmation. Hunters recorded these traces meticulously, knowing that persistence and care were essential to eventual success. Each misdirection offered a lesson in caution, observation, and the patience required to separate rumor from fact. Tropical storms, rivers swollen by rain, and dense foliage slowed progress, reminding agents that time itself was a quiet ally and occasional adversary. Yet even setbacks contributed to the map of pursuit, revealing gaps, possible routes, and patterns of evasion. And as hunters adjusted their course, the rhythm of the search continued, quiet and methodical, moving always forward. Encounters with locals often required diplomacy as much as observation. Conversations were slow, polite, and attentive, seeking small details without alarm. Cultural norms and community trust shaped the path of inquiry, revealing subtle truths in gestures, pauses, and casual mentions. Every meal, every market visit, every handshake carried the potential for insight. Hunters learned to read patterns of habit, noting who moved when, who spoke with whom, and what absences might signify. In the dense green of the jungle and the quiet streets of small towns, these small gestures became the instruments of memory and discovery, and each subtle signal brought the presence of fugitives into sharper, though still delicate focus, and through patient observation, the landscape of concealment began to open its secrets. The pursuit demanded both courage and restraint. Knowing that a single mistake could undo months of patient work, nighttime brought its own rhythm, with agents listening to soft nocturnal sounds and observing without intrusion. Coded messages traveled carefully, ensuring that contacts remained safe while maintaining continuity of the investigation. Agents relied on intuition honed by years of historical knowledge and field experience. Each new lead, however faint, was treated with care, its potential weighed against time, distance, and context. Even the smallest confirmation, a familiar name in a document, a fleeting gesture in a crowd, was a quiet victory. And in the lush, humid silence, every soft observation added to a slowly forming mosaic of pursuit. Over months, the agents began to trace networks of movement and concealment, connecting cities, villages, and hidden refuges. Names reappeared in unexpected places, letters hinted at unrecorded routes, and memories intersected with geography in delicate, illuminating ways. The hunt became both external and internal, a meditation on patience, morality, and the persistence of memory across continents. Even the smallest discoveries, a roof painted a certain color, a habitual market visit, a repeated name, held significance in the broader pattern. The jungle and its surrounding towns seemed to guide them, soft currents leading to paths of understanding, and each careful step drew them closer to figures who had eluded justice for decades, while respecting the quiet flow of time. As the chapter of pursuit in South America unfolded, hunters recognized both the difficulty and the necessity of patient observation. False trails, tropical silence, and distant rumors all contributed to the larger rhythm of the hunt. Every town, every market, every fleeting encounter was a part of the delicate mapping of lives hidden in plain sight. And while some fugitives remained distant shadows, the patient work of documentation, observation, and reflection slowly brought clarity. In every small-town bar, there was a face that looked too familiar, a reminder that history moves quietly, often unseen, yet never entirely absent. And as the sun rose over rivers and canopy, the pursuit continued, calm, deliberate, and unbroken, stretching ever toward distant horizons. The work of the hunters was relentless, a steady pursuit of shadows that often left them weary, both in body and in spirit. Years of tracing fugitives, following faint clues across continents, and negotiating bureaucracies took their quiet toll. Sleep was often interrupted by memories of testimony, the soft weight of unspoken grief pressing at the edges of consciousness. Threats came unpredictably, sometimes as letters, sometimes as distant warnings, a subtle reminder that the line between hunter and hunted could blur. Even in safe offices or quiet hotel rooms, vigilance became a rhythm, a constant undercurrent to daily life. relationships strained under the weight of obsession and dedication, leaving moments of isolation wrapped in the comfort of duty. The persistence of fugitives, their continued elusiveness, challenged not only the hunter's skill, but also their sense of self. And in the quiet corridors of investigation, the hunters sometimes glimpsed the shadows they pursued reflected back at themselves. Burnout emerged subtly, in small miscalculations, in longer pauses, in the weight of years spent pursuing lives hidden from view. Agents learned to balance vigilance with introspection, measuring effort against the need to preserve themselves. Journals were kept, notes compiled, letters reviewed again and again, sometimes serving as both record and refuge. The jungle, the city, the quiet offices became spaces for both reflection and strategy, where solitude was as necessary as observation. And yet the persistent threat of discovery, by those they hunted or by those who resented their work, remained a quiet, omnipresent hum. Even when surrounded by allies, the hunter often walked alone, the burden of memory and responsibility pressing softly yet persistently. And through these quiet trials, the hunters discovered that endurance was as much internal as external. Revenge attacks, though rare, reminded the hunters of the delicate balance between pursuit and peril. A misplaced message, a suspicious contact, a shadow lingering too long could suggest more than coincidence. They learned to interpret silence as carefully as speech, the absence of expected signals carrying subtle meaning. Each encounter demanded calm, careful judgment and a steady hand, even when fear brushed softly at awareness. Over time, the hunters cultivated resilience, a quiet strength born of measured patience and deliberate pacing. Friends and colleagues became confidants, offering both counsel and a mirror to the subtle fatigue that accompanied years of tracking the hidden. And in this careful vigilance, the hunters navigated the faint line between justice and jeopardy. Public perception sometimes questioned the hunters' motives, casting shadows over their patient, deliberate work. Newspapers and commentators debated methods, suggesting overreach or obsession. Yet the hunters understood that history required persistence and that memory demanded patience. Each report, each whisper of doubt was weighed and measured, allowing reflection without haste. Even in the face of scrutiny, their rhythm remained slow and deliberate, a meditation on endurance and ethical responsibility. Daily tasks, research, correspondence, interviews became both practice and therapy, sustaining both mission and mind. The constant presence of memory, both personal and historical, framed every decision, every cautious step forward. And in quiet resolve, the hunters held firm, aware that the pursuit of truth often traveled a lonely path. Physical exhaustion mingled with emotional strain, creating a landscape of subtle fatigue that required careful tending. Long travels through humid streets, dense forests, or distant cities brought aching limbs and quiet aches of patience. Yet even in weariness, the hunters observed with careful attention, noting details others might overlook. Meetings with witnesses, casual conversations in foreign towns, and the steady review of historical documents became practices in sustained mindfulness. Their tools were memory, observation, and quiet moral attention, each applied with deliberate care. And in this rhythm, fatigue became manageable, integrated into the steady cadence of pursuit. And as days blurred into months, the hunters' quiet endurance carried them forward. The psychological toll was often invisible, reflected in quiet moments of reflection or solitary walks through streets and forests. Memories of survivors' voices, of unrecorded details, and of unseen atrocities lingered softly, like shadows at the edges of awareness. Hunters found ways to carry these memories without being consumed, writing, speaking, or walking among trees or quiet waters to release the weight. Even the hum of a distant city, the soft ripple of a river, or the whisper of wind through leaves could serve as both refuge and reminder. Each day required deliberate attention to the balance between pursuit and personal preservation. And in this balance, the hunters learned that vigilance and self-care were intertwined, each sustaining the other. Threats, false leads, and occasional betrayal reinforced the subtle hazards of their work. Agents learned to approach each situation with measured caution, weighing evidence against intuition and experience. Even when facing deception, patience was the primary tool, allowing time to reveal both truth and motive. Every message, every clue, every human interaction was part of a larger pattern, gently unfolding across continents and decades. The hunter's work became a quiet meditation on justice itself, a reflection on the endurance required to maintain moral clarity in a world of evasion. And with each careful step, they maintained the steady rhythm of pursuit, while guarding the fragile equilibrium of their own lives. Ultimately, the hunter's quiet perseverance preserved both history and conscience. Though moments of fear and fatigue lingered, their work continued with deliberate reflective patience. Justice, though sometimes delayed and elusive, advanced through careful observation, methodical documentation, and unwavering moral attention. And even when the line between hunter and hunted threatened to blur, their calm resolve allowed them to navigate the shadowed landscape of pursuit. Memories were preserved, traces followed, and patience became a guiding principle. To chase darkness long enough is to risk being swallowed by it. Yet in the gentle persistence of those who pursue, the light of conscience endures quietly across time. Years passed, and silence settled over the trails once pursued with urgency. Yet hidden in cold, dimly lit rooms, stacks of paper waited patiently to be discovered. Archives untouched for decades held whispers of complicity, shadows of choices made long ago. The Stasi files, meticulously recorded, offered maps of observation, surveillance, and unspoken cooperation. CIA and other intelligence records, once classified, revealed quiet bargains, alliances, and oversights that had shaped history. Investigators, historians, and scholars approached these archives with gentle care, reading slowly, absorbing the details with reflective patience. Each document carried the weight of memory, the texture of human decision, and the quiet resonance of truth. And as pages turned, a broader understanding began to emerge from the quiet corridors of bureaucracy. The slow illumination of archival records revealed connections previously invisible. Names, dates, and correspondences traced pathways across borders, revealing how some fugitives moved unchallenged while others were quietly monitored. Each file contained careful notation, small observations, and coded references that required time to decipher. Historians followed these trails like soft currents, linking one document to another, one memory to the next. Even minor details, a footnote, a signature, a repeated phrase, offered insight into hidden decisions and overlooked responsibilities. The paper spoke in measured tones, soft yet precise, delivering truths that could not be hurried or ignored. And in the stillness of archives, the past whispered insistently, demanding patient attention. The revelation of complicity was not sudden but gradual, like sunlight filtering slowly through dense fog. Investigators found traces of hesitation, compromise, and deliberate inaction, each quietly documented in carefully labeled folders. The weight of bureaucracy, once invisible, now became tangible, revealing the subtleties of choice and consequence. Cold ink and neatly typed words bore witness to the quiet machinery of history, sometimes revealing moral ambiguity in its starkest form. Each document was a lesson in patience, teaching that truth often arrives slowly, requiring careful attention and gentle observation. Researchers moved through these records with a measured rhythm, absorbing the texture of human decision across decades. And with each discovery, the quiet constellations of past actions became slightly more illuminated. Some revelations were small, almost imperceptible. A report noting a fleeting visit, a brief mention of assistance, a delayed communication. Yet together these fragments created patterns that spoke louder than individual lines ever could. Observers traced the movement of individuals, the flow of information, and the decisions that allowed history's shadows to persist. Even in the stillness of archived rooms, the rhythm of human consequence was palpable. The past preserved on paper demanded both patience and reflection, resisting simplification or hurried judgment. Each revelation carried a gentle weight, the soft pressure of understanding settling quietly in the mind. And the archive, silent yet persistent, whispered its truths to those who listened carefully. Newly declassified documents revealed networks of quiet accommodation, arrangements that often blurred the lines between moral and practical decisions. Intelligence agencies, sometimes acting cautiously, sometimes negligently, left trails of influence across continents. The records were not only evidence of the past, but also instruments of reflection for the present. Scholars piecing together the intricate web noticed recurring names, repeated phrases, and subtle signals of oversight. Every page offered both clarity and ambiguity, inviting contemplation of human behavior in extreme circumstances. And as researchers read, the soft patterns of history emerged, connecting choices, omissions, and consequences across decades. Among these papers were glimpses of personal struggles, of individuals caught between duty and conscience. Reports noted hesitation, subtle protest, and occasional moral courage, quietly expressed through documents and correspondence. These small acts, recorded in ink and type, formed a counterpoint to larger narratives of concealment and complicity. Investigators and historians traced these threads patiently, understanding that truth often arrives not as revelation, but as accumulation. Even the smallest detail could illuminate the contours of human choice, and the archive's rhythm demanded careful attention to absorb the totality. And with each careful reading, the human dimension of history unfolded softly, like light diffusing through thin curtains. The revelations did not arrive all at once. They required a quiet, sustained engagement with layers of paper, filing systems, and catalogues. Each discovery prompted reflection, a gentle meditation on how ordinary choices intersected with extraordinary events. Slowly, a portrait emerged of networks, alliances, and omissions, the unseen scaffolding upon which history had quietly rested. The archivist's work became a dialogue with the past, a slow conversation across time, mediated through letters, reports, and annotations. Patience and care were necessary to understand the soft patterns of truth. And in this quiet unfolding, decades later, the paper spoke, and it did not lie. As more records were studied, the moral landscape of the post-war years became increasingly visible, nuanced and measured. Hidden bargains, deferred justice, and silent facilitation revealed themselves across continents and decades. The weight of these truths was neither abrupt nor harsh. It settled slowly, like soft light over distant hills. The work of interpretation required calm reflection, careful reading, and gentle attention to detail, archives once silent now resonated with quiet authority, shaping understanding and memory. Decades later, the paper spoke, and it did not lie, revealing a soft but persistent truth that would guide memory, reflection, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. Time softens the sharp edges of history, leaving only memory and reflection in its quiet wake. Survivors, once young and frightened, now age with stories etched into their voices and gestures. Their recollections carry the weight of years, tempered by distance yet vivid in the mind's eye. Letters, photographs, and journals become gentle companions in their contemplation of the past. In parallel, former perpetrators age as well, some speaking with remorse, others quietly burdened by what they carried for decades. Conversations, interviews, and legal proceedings reveal the fragility of human memory, its capacity for both truth and omission. Every confession or recollection is measured, deliberate, as if time itself demanded careful attention. And in these exchanges the sharp outlines of history blur into soft contours of humanity. A former soldier, now elderly, recounts a day long past, his voice calm, measured, aware of the fragility of time. A survivor listens, not with anger, but with patience, allowing memory to breathe without disturbance. The quiet gravity of these meetings transforms understanding, emphasizing human complexity over simplistic narratives. Even decades after events, each conversation uncovers small insights, a gesture, a tone, a hesitation that illuminate past actions. Observers, whether scholars or family members, listen attentively, aware that the weight of memory is often carried in silence as much as in words. The rhythm of remembrance is slow, a gentle unfolding of experience over the expanse of years. And as stories unfold, the faces behind the files emerge, reminding the world of the enduring presence of human life. Perpetrators, now old, are no longer the shadows of their former selves. They walk slowly, speak cautiously, and carry the quiet gravity of lived consequence. Their words, when they come, are tinged with the softness of reflection and the distance of decades. Some acknowledge their actions with regret, others remain distant, caught in the persistence of memory and avoidance. The passage of time both reveals and obscures, allowing small truths to surface while hiding many more. Investigators and historians listen, attentive to subtle shifts in tone and expression, finding insight in what is said and in what is left unsaid. Each human face, each weathered hand, offers a tactile reminder of the lived passage of time, and in these moments, history becomes less a ledger of deeds and more a meditation on life, choice, and consequence. Witnesses reflect on lost friends, forgotten places, and the quiet resilience of ordinary life amidst extraordinary circumstances. Their faces, lined with age and experience, carry the imprint of memory without fury or flourish. The cadence of speech mirrors the rhythm of life itself, slow, deliberate, reflective. They recount moments that seemed trivial at the time, now revealing the depth of human endurance. Even brief pauses in conversation carry meaning, a space where memory gathers and settles softly. The act of remembering becomes almost meditative, a gentle acknowledgement of continuity and loss. And as their words drift into silence, the weight of decades rests lightly, yet unmistakably, between speaker and listener. Photographs and letters, once static, now pulse with quiet life, connecting past to present in delicate resonance. A child seen in a photograph decades ago now walks as an elder, and faces once unknown are recognized through memory's lens. The fragility of time is evident in yellowed paper, fading ink, and worn edges, yet the stories persist, carried forward in human reflection. Scholars and family members move gently through these traces, allowing the past to unfold without force or haste. The hush of historical inquiry mirrors the calm of lived experience, a rhythm in which every detail matters, yet none overwhelms. And in the soft glow of recollection, faces behind the files emerge more vividly than the documents alone could convey. Confessions, formal or informal, become acts of reconciliation with the passage of years. A former officer speaks quietly of choices made, measured against the landscape of consequences. Survivors listen, sometimes with nods, sometimes with gentle silence, acknowledging both suffering and understanding. The dialogue is calm, reflective, a gentle weaving of lives that history had long separated. Time itself moderates anger and impatience, allowing empathy and observation to coexist. Every meeting becomes a subtle meditation on the flow of years and the endurance of memory. And as words fade into silence, the human dimension of history settles softly, leaving an impression more lasting than any report. Even legal proceedings take on a different cadence when viewed through the lens of age. Witnesses and defendants alike move slowly, speak carefully, and listen with awareness of time's passage. The courtroom, once charged with urgency, now carries a gentle weight, a contemplative rhythm that honors memory without force. Questions are answered with deliberation, reflection, and occasional pauses, each pause a space where history itself breathes. Observers note the subtle interplay of human emotion, restraint, and insight, learning that justice is both procedural and profoundly human. The frailty of time softens conflict, revealing shared vulnerability alongside enduring consequence. And in this rhythm, history unfolds calmly, its moral contours rendered in quiet reflection. In the end, the files that once recorded deeds, evidence, and names become companions to the living. Survivors and perpetrators alike face the passage of time with quiet acceptance, allowing memory to guide reflection rather than resentment. Every encounter, every letter, every photograph forms a network of human experience that stretches across decades. History, finally, is no longer about monsters or abstraction, but about men and women navigating choices, consequences, and memory. History was no longer about monsters, only men and what they became, and in that quiet recognition, understanding and humanity endure softly across the gentle horizon of time. In the early years of the new millennium, the pursuit of justice continued quietly, long after most hunters had slowed their pace. Defendants, now aged, walked slowly into courtrooms that were calm yet heavy with expectation. Each trial carried a dual weight, the personal reckoning of those on the stand, and the collective memory of a world still processing loss. Witnesses, some in their 70s or 80s, spoke softly, their voices deliberate, their words carrying decades of reflection. Legal teams moved methodically, ensuring that each testimony, each record, each detail received measured attention. Even in their frailty, defendants were treated with the dignity of due process, their past actions considered carefully against evidence and law. Observers sensed the quiet intensity, a rhythm shaped by patience rather than urgency, where every step mattered. And as the days of testimony unfolded, the courtroom became a vessel for memory, reflection, and solemn reckoning. The trials were marked by the subtle interplay of past and present, where decades-old events were reframed through contemporary understanding. Legal arguments moved slowly, weaving history into law, and law into reflection. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys spoke with measured cadence, aware that words carried the weight of history. Witnesses recalled moments with care, emphasizing nuance over emotion, describing choices, consequences, and memory itself. Even minor details, the location of a document, a date in a ledger, a gesture remembered, became significant threads in the quiet fabric of the trial. Time itself became an actor, shaping testimony, demeanor, and attention. And as the trials progressed, the courtroom's rhythm carried the echo of years spent tracing lives, actions, and memory. Defendants were often frail, their movements slow, their voices tempered by age and reflection. They answered questions with deliberation, aware that the weight of decades rested gently on each response. Witnesses observed carefully, noting subtle gestures, quiet pauses, and the cadence of speech. Each exchange became a meditation on responsibility, choice, and the passage of time. Observers, historians, families, and court staff listened with reverence, absorbing the subtle human complexity of accountability. Even the silence between words carried meaning, as if time itself pressed softly upon the room. And in this delicate balance, the pursuit of justice found its calm, reflective expression. Symbolic verdicts often mattered as much as legal ones, carrying messages beyond the immediate proceedings. The courtroom, though quiet, resonated with the weight of collective memory. Judgments were delivered slowly, sentences read deliberately, and the reactions of all present softened by years of patience. Each verdict was a quiet acknowledgement of the persistence of human conscience and the endurance of moral reflection. The room held the gravity of history tempered by calm, allowing memory and law to coexist in measured rhythm. And as each trial concluded, the echoes of decades-long pursuit lingered softly in the corridors of law and memory. Family members of victims sometimes attended quietly, their faces reflecting resilience and reflection rather than fury. Their presence reminded all that trials were not only legal exercises but also spaces of remembrance and connection. Conversations outside courtrooms were subdued, measured, respectful, often reflecting on lives rebuilt and histories preserved. Witnesses spoke softly of memory, continuity, and the quiet lessons learned from decades of pursuit. Even journalists and scholars approached reporting with restraint, emphasizing reflection over sensationalism. And in the calm of these interactions, history felt both personal and collective, an enduring thread woven through decades of experience. Trials in the 2000s also highlighted the fragility of memory and the strength of documentation. Witnesses relied on letters, diaries, and archived records, cross-referencing memories with written evidence. Defendants referenced long-ago orders and recollections, sometimes faltering, sometimes precise. Each document became a soft bridge between past and present, connecting human recollection with the permanence of paper. Observers noted the rhythm of this careful interplay, where words, memory, and evidence merged gently into a coherent account. And with every cross-examination, every testimony, and every review of archival records, the courtroom maintained a calm, reflective tempo. Media coverage was careful, often focusing on the historical importance rather than dramatic detail. Stories emphasized lessons of memory, continuity, and moral vigilance. Even photographers and reporters respected the subdued atmosphere, recording without intrusion. Interviews with survivors, historians, and legal experts highlighted reflection over sensationalism, quiet over urgency. Each narrative became a meditation on the persistence of memory and the careful work of justice. And as these trials reached their conclusion, the world absorbed the quiet power of accountability, framed in the gentle passage of time. Ultimately, the last trials were less about retribution and more about preservation, preserving memory, conscience, and historical truth. Aged defendants, patient witnesses, and meticulous courts together formed the final chapter of a pursuit begun decades earlier, and each acknowledgement became a quiet testament to the endurance of justice and human attention. The courtroom fell silent, but the echo did not fade. It traveled softly into history, carrying lessons of patience, reflection, and the quiet persistence of conscience across generations. The work of the hunters, once urgent and relentless, now resides in memory and reflection. Decades of pursuit have left traces in archives, testimony, and the quiet conscience of the world. Survivors live with stories carried softly, passed through families, communities, and history books. Perpetrators who were brought to account remain symbols of both human failing and accountability. The landscape of justice stretches across time, a gentle arc shaped by persistence, patience, and moral attention. Even in quietude, the lessons of memory endure, whispering across continents and generations. Every document, photograph, and recollection becomes a thread in a tapestry of remembrance. And as these threads gather, they form a calm, resilient fabric of historical conscience. The hunters themselves, many long retired, reflect on decades spent tracing shadows and echoes of the past. Their diaries, letters, and records are now artifacts, quietly revealing method, patience, and the moral imperatives that guided them. Some walk through cities and forests where they once followed leads, noticing only the soft sounds of wind and footsteps. Others sit with photographs and files, allowing memory to settle gently without urgency. Each act of recollection becomes a meditation on human endurance and moral responsibility. Time has softened the sharp edges of pursuit, leaving only the steady rhythm of reflection and remembrance. And in these quiet moments, the essence of their work becomes clear, the preservation of conscience over decades. Survivors and witnesses, once bearing the full weight of history, now age with stories carefully tended. Their memories ripple outward, touching grandchildren, neighbors, and scholars who seek understanding. The past is no longer immediate, but it remains vivid in subtle ways. In a pause, a smile, a remembered gesture, conversations move gently, measured by respect and patience, allowing reflection to bloom in silence. The human dimension of history persists, softening with time yet never fading entirely. Even fleeting details, a letter, a photograph, a whispered recollection, carry resonance across years. And as memory continues to unfold, it becomes a quiet companion to justice itself. Institutions, museums, and archives hold these histories like reservoirs of light, allowing knowledge to flow slowly to those willing to observe. Scholars, educators, and family members trace the arcs of accountability with care, learning from both action and inaction. Each record and exhibit offers a gentle meditation on morality's consequence and human complexity. Even in the stillness of these spaces, the pulse of memory can be felt, measured in quiet footsteps and whispered reflections. Historical truth is preserved not only in facts, but in the slow rhythm of understanding. And through this preservation, justice gains a subtle, enduring presence beyond immediate verdicts. The moral inheritance of the hunter's work extends quietly into modern society, shaping law, ethics, and conscience. New generations of students and citizens learn the importance of vigilance, empathy, and patience. Historical lessons ripple gently through classrooms, discussions, and reflective moments, carrying the echo of decades of pursuit. Even in the calm of contemporary life, the framework of accountability persists, soft but steady, a reminder of what endurance and careful attention can achieve. Time does not erase the past, it allows it to settle into the collective memory, quietly guiding reflection and understanding. And in this ongoing quiet, justice finds continuity, a subtle but persistent rhythm across generations. Forgiveness and reconciliation, where possible, emerge as gentle companions to accountability. Survivors sometimes find peace not in forgetting, but in the deliberate act of remembering without bitterness. Perpetrators who acknowledge their actions contribute, however slowly, to the broader moral dialogue. The passage of time softens anger, replacing it with reflection, insight, and the quiet cultivation of conscience. Each conversation, letter, and meeting becomes part of the slow, continuous flow of historical understanding. Memory itself becomes a gentle teacher, illustrating both human frailty and moral resilience. And as these lessons accumulate, they form a landscape where reflection carries as much weight as judgment. The sound of remembrance is subtle, felt in quiet rooms, muted libraries, and the careful turn of a page. It is heard in footsteps, along corridors of archives, in whispered stories shared across generations, and in the deliberate act of reflection. Every detail, every nuance, every recollection contributes to a larger, serene understanding of justice and memory. Time allows perspective to deepen, revealing patterns of action, consequence, and moral attention that were once invisible. Even in silence, history speaks softly, its voice measured, hypnotic, and enduring. And in this resonance, the work of the hunters and the lives of the remembered converge into a calm, lasting meditation. As the last trials conclude, the archives settle, and the witnesses age, the quiet inheritance of the Nazi hunters persists. Their work has transformed the memory of war, the understanding of justice, and the rhythm of historical reflection. Lessons endure, not as noise or spectacle, but as subtle currents in the conscience of the world. Every act of remembrance, every reflection, every quiet observation extends the soft pulse of accountability across time. Justice, like memory, never truly ends, it only grows quieter, carrying its gentle resonance across the horizon of history, inviting all who listen to reflect, remember, and continue the calm vigilance of conscience.